Ideas Network brings you the CBC Massey Lectures for 1969. Time as History by George Grant. Tonight, Professor Grant concludes the philosophical work he set out to do with us 5 weeks ago, when he began this disciplined and passionate examination of the crisis of modern civilization. In this fifth talk, he faces not only Nietzsche's question of who deserve to be the masters of the earth, but the essential question about the modern project, the question of mastery itself. And he invites us to reconsider receptivity. George Grant, on Time as History.
I have brushed against the work of Nietzsche because he has thought the conception of time as history more comprehensively than any other thinker. In his work, the fate of technological man, the modern project, is laid bare before us. And in thinking it, he did not turn away from it. His critical wit about modern society might lead one to believe that Nietzsche condemned the modern project. In fact, he said yes to its fundamental assumptions. He expressed the contradictions and difficulties in the thought and life of Western civilization, not for the sake of turning men away from that enterprise, but so that they could overcome its difficulties and fulfill its potential heights. In his work, the themes that must be thought in thinking time as history are raised to a beautiful explicitness: the mastery of the earth, the technology of nature and of man, the primacy of the will, man as the creator of his own values, the finality of becoming, the assertion that potentiality is higher than actuality, that motion is better than rest. The simpler things that Nietzsche says, for example, that man must now live without horizons, seem so obvious to most people today that they are hardly worth emphasizing. Everybody today uses the word values to describe our making of the world. Capitalists and socialists, atheists and churchmen, scientists and politicians. The word comes to us so obviously that we take it to belong to the way the world is. What point is there in emphasizing the word? The point is that before Nietzsche, men did not think about their actions in those terms. They did not much talk about values. They talked about goods. They did not make the world valuable. They participated in its goodness. Indeed, even some of the deeper parts of Nietzsche's thought have become explicit in our world. If one listens carefully to the revolt of the young against bourgeois America that has characterized this decade, one hears deeper notes in it than were ever sounded by Marx, and those deeper notes are above all the notes of Nietzsche. As I have said, the thought of great thinkers is not a matter for the chit-chat of television and cocktail parties, nor to provide jobs for academics in the culture industry. In it, the fate of whole civilizations, the fate of our living, is expressed. In this sense, the thought of Nietzsche is a fate for modern man. But as I have implied throughout, the conception of time as history is not one in which I can live. Let me put it this way. A friend with whom I have spent many hours studying Nietzsche died last week. He knew that he was dying, not in the sense that we all know that this is going to happen sometime, but as a clear term that had been put upon his life at an early age, long before what he was fitted for could be accomplished. In telling me how he lived in the presence of his own death, he once said, "Nietzsche is not true." What he meant by that shorthand phrase is that the whole did not appear to him as chaos, that the whole to which man alone is open may be immensely strange, and in his case seemingly arbitrary, but that it is to be trusted. Clearly such a remark is not argument or proof. Obviously neither the man who made it nor myself are within any distance at all of a great thinker such as Nietzsche. It was not a remark coming from realized philosophy, but made out of reverence, or in the vulgar modern terminology for reverence, it would be called religious. Now, our reverences come to us not only in the particularities of our reasonings and experiences as individuals, but from out of tradition. The word tradition means literally a handing over, or as it once meant, a surrender. The man who made the remark to me about Nietzsche was surrendering to me what had been surrendered to him. What had been surrendered to him was the reverence coming over many generations from Athens and Jerusalem. He surrendered to me the affirmation that the whole is in some unfathomable sense good. The absurdities of time, indeed also its joys as well as its diremptions, are to be taken not simply as history, but as enfolded in a meaning, call it if you will a transcendence, which is beyond potentiality, which is beyond change. I do not imply that what is handed over in tradition must be in conflict with reason or experience. The belief that reason and tradition are at loggerheads is only a product of modern thought. It comes from the doctrine of progress, that the race as a whole is becoming increasingly open to reason by shuffling off its irrational past. The traditions that came to us from Athens and Jerusalem claimed to be in the main reasonable, but what was handed over in them is now accepted, if accepted at all, less and less as thought-filled, because it has been so assailed by the modern account of reason. And all of us are increasingly enclosed by that modern account. The core of the history of the last 300 years has been the criticism of the ancient account of thought and the coming to be of the new account. As that criticism has publicly succeeded, what comes to us from the past is received as unintelligible, as simply arbitrary. That we must speak of two accounts of reason, the ancient and the modern, can be seen in the fact that for the ancients, thought was at its height not an action, but what they called a passion. Whatever the differences in what came to us from Jerusalem and from Athens, on this central point there was a commonness. The height for man was a passion. In modern language, we might weakly describe this by saying that thought was finally a receptivity. We can see that this is not true of modern thought, because its very form is the making of hypotheses and the testing by experiment, something intimately connected with the acts of our wills, the controlling of the world, the making of history. Indeed, the enormous difficulty of thinking outside the modern account of thought is seen in my using the very word passion. Words which once summoned up receptivity have disappeared or disintegrated into triviality. If I were to use the noblest Greek word for this receptivity, pathos, and say, as has been said, that philosophy arises from the pathos of astonishment, the suffering of astonishment, the word would bear no relation to our present use of it. When we say pathetic, we may be thinking of a defeated character in a movie, like Ratso in Midnight Cowboy. We say that the quarterback for the Hamilton Tiger Cats was pathetic this season, meaning that he did not do what he was supposed to do. As for the word suffering, that means simply pain, which sensible men have always wished to avoid. The word passion has come to be limited for us to little more than an emotion of driving force or intense sexual excitement. The experiences of receptivity having dropped from our vocabulary, we think of art and thought and morality quite differently. We talk of what the artist does as creation, not as imitation, a begetting on the beautiful. We consider morality the creating of our own values, not a partaking in an intelligible order. The archetype of reason is science, which frames hypotheses and tests them in experiment. As an example of the poverty of modern language, let me say how partial it is to speak of Tolstoy as creating War and Peace, or Mozart his piano concertos. The disappearance of the words of receptivity, the words of passion, from the modern account of thought, shows what a wide separation there is between the ancient and the modern. It clarifies what it means to say that modern thinking is always a kind of willing. Because we are all surrounded, in every conscious minute of our lives, by the modern conception of thought, we cannot take what is given to us from the past as intelligible. If we take it at all, we take it more and more as sheerly arbitrary. Therefore, fewer and fewer people can appropriate it. My doubts that men can live fully when they conceive time simply as history stem from my inability to discount the ancient view of thought. But that view of thought is increasingly hard to articulate. Nevertheless, any appeal to the past must not imply a foolish thought of return. We live now, and anything that turns us away from living now is destructive or trivializing. To use the past to insulate us from living now is cowardly, worse, despairing. And to live in the present, one must know that one lives in a civilization, the fate of which is to conceive time as history. What most men now inherit is the idea of time as history. The tradition is now orientation to the future. And as I have said, that inheritance is most comprehensively thought, most beautifully articulated in the writings of Nietzsche. Therefore, as living now, the task of thought among those held by something which cannot allow them to say yes to time as history is not to inoculate themselves against the present, but first to enter what is thought in that present. Let me make an analogy with what has happened in North America concerning the thought of Marx. Since 1945, our chief rival empire has been ruled by men who spoke in the language of Marx's doctrine. The thought of Marx, therefore, appeared to our rulers as a threatening disease. The intellectual industry of officialdom, that is, our multiversities, therefore produced a spate of refutations of Marx. Most of these, however, were written with the purpose of inoculating others against Marx, rather than with thinking the thoughts that Marx had thought. These books have not prevented the reviving influence of Marx's thought. Why? Marx's influence abides because he thought some of what is happening in the modern world. His writings could therefore help other men to think about what was happening. What we were doing in Vietnam seemed to be explained by Marxism. To speak in the crudest manner, you cannot be successful at inoculation by pretending you are a greater thinker than Marx when you are a lesser. To apply the analogy, my purpose is not to inoculate against Nietzsche, against my betters. As I have said, Nietzsche thinks what it is to be a modern man more comprehensively, more deeply than any other thinker, including Marx, including Freud, including the existentialists, including the positivists. Therefore, the first task of somebody trying to think time as history, is not to inoculate, but to think his thoughts. Let's leave the task of inoculation to those who write the textbooks. Yet if I am right that in the thought of Nietzsche we drink most deeply of the modern experiment, we cannot finally avoid making some judgments of that experiment, and so of that thought. We might start from our current experience and argue that since Nietzsche's day more evidence is in. As one looks at the vulgar and chaotic results of our frenetic dynamism, it is possible to say that the modern project has led men away from excellence, and that this debasement is not accidental, but comes forth from the very assumptions of that project. Then one would say that these debasements are not to be overcome by a further extension of the modern assumptions, as Nietzsche would have it. If one denies the possibility of any returning to the past, and yet does not believe in the assumptions of the modern experiment, what then is the task of thought? At any place or time, human beings are open to the whole in thought, and yet the intelligibility of the whole eludes them. But in the present, the way to intelligibility is blocked by a more than usual number of ambiguities. Our present is like being lost in the wilderness, because every pine and rock appears to us as both known and unknown, and therefore as uncertain pointers on the way back to human habitation. And the sun is hidden by the clouds, so we cannot use a compass. The very bringing into being of our civilization has put in question the older means of finding one's way, without discovering new means for doing so. Nevertheless, it is also clear that this very position of ambiguity in our civilization presents enormous hope for thought, if not for life. The question whether the modern project opens out new heights for men, or whether at its heart it was a false turning for man, is so clearly before us. Questions which were settled and therefore closed over the last centuries are now open to us once again. Perhaps the essential question about the modern project is not that of Nietzsche, who deserved to be the masters of the earth, but the very question of mastery itself. In the words of a great contemporary, Leo Strauss, oblivion of eternity, or in other words, estrangement from man's deepest desire, and therewith from the primary issues, is the price which modern man had to pay from the very beginning for attempting to be absolutely sovereign, to become the master and owner of nature, to conquer chance. When I say that in an era of disintegration there are great opportunities for thought, if not for life, I am not denying that in North America at the present there are attempts to overcome living as if time were history. The most intelligent and imaginative young make attempts through communities, through drugs, through sexuality, etc. The greatest English novelist of this century, D.H. Lawrence, has shown that in realized sexuality the will to will is overcome. Even the present restless concentration on sexuality as a commodity carries within it some dim attempt to overcome time. Whatever the madnesses in the worlds of drugs and theatre, there is something more in them than sensationalism and entertainment, an attempt to take life into a meaning that does not depend on our willing. The same is true of those who wish to make communities outside the dynamism of General Motors, General Multiversity, and General Electric. The same desire is obvious in the attempts all over this continent to appropriate the timelessness in the religions of Asia. Nevertheless, these efforts batter against the fact that they must be lived out within the perimeter of the total society, and this is given over to time as mastery. That is, the attempts must be essentially private, and in living the private is, by its very nature, always limited. In saying that questions about time that have been closed over the last centuries are open to us once again, I am not, I would repeat, advocating any return to some past moment. As we were, we shall never be again as we were. Let me make the point in terms of the history of religions. As one looks at that history, there are two great rivers, compared to which all other traditions are but little streams. The first of these rivers is Indic religion, what we in the West might characterize quickly as Hinduism and Buddhism. The other great river is the Semitic or biblical, specified as Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. To speak without qualification about either of these would be to distort. Nevertheless, it seems possible as an outsider to say that Indic religion accomplishes a wonderful enfolding of all the distinctions and absurdities of existence into a transcendent unity, which allows men to live with amazing calm and beauty. This was achieved by building the most comprehensive spiritual technology which encompasses every aspect of life and every kind of existing. This spiritual technology has operated at every level: cult and myth, thought and contemplation. Among those within it, there appears a unity between living and thinking, which one does not generally find among Westerners. Because Asia has been assailed for 300 years by Western conquest, Europeans were rarely interested in looking at it, even when they were in its midst. From the other great tradition, I single out Christianity, both because it has been the dominant Western form and because it is my own. What seems to me unique about Christianity is the way it opened men so deeply to anxiety, charity, and shame. Through these it opened them to historical existing. Listen to the Passions according to St. Matthew and St. John as composed by Bach. One will be listening to the supreme commentary on Gethsemane and Golgotha. I do not imply that in Christianity, anxiety, in its deepest form, anxiety towards death, is taken as final. The modern swinging Christians who move towards eliminating eternity from Christianity seem to me foolish flatterers, misinterpreting Christianity to make it acceptable to modernity. Of course, Christianity placed anxiety and love and the desolating of the good within an eternal order, an economy in which they were lifted up. But it still opened men to historical existing, because these experiences were made the very stuff of salvation. Men were not to be shut off from them by reliance on the marvelous world of spiritual technology. Existence in time was a necessary pilgrimage through which the individual and the race had to pass. And let me say that the metaphor of pilgrimage was not used because men happened to go on pilgrimages. Rather, they went on pilgrimages to symbolize the fact that they comprehended time in this way. In this sense, the events of time, in all their anxiety, and with all their demands on love, were seen as necessary, as the flesh and bones of realization. The secularizing of Christianity by modern philosophy and science has kept hold of that concentration upon the particularities of time. After all, to say that something is secularized is not to deny that it was a particular something that was secularized. And the secularized Christianity of the modern has kept within itself the intense experiences of anxiety and charity and shame. What is Marxism without charity? What is existentialism without anxiety? Even Nietzsche, who in a shallow reading might be taken as the great critic of Christianity, is penetrated with that language of time, which rings throughout his thought with the unmistakable note of Christianity. To put the matter negatively, the modern project has kept the concentration on time while taking it out of any enfoldment in eternity. The result is time, known and experienced in every lived minute as history. In this dark moment of Western civilization, when time as history presses upon our wills as an undirected mastery, from that very undirectedness there arises a potentiality for thought, an openness to rethink what it would be for living to be more than willing. But the point I am making from the history of religions is that rethinking cannot be a simple turning away from what Western civilization has been, a denial of that openness to historical existing. Indeed, it is a great good for Western people in their time of darkness to contemplate with care the sources of thought and life as they have been in Asia. But that meeting with Asia will be only a kind of esoteric game if it is undertaken to escape the deepest roots of our own fate. We can only come to any real encounter with Asia if we come in the high recognition of what we inevitably are. Nobody can know what is going to happen to Western civilization. One possibility is the atomic holocaust, and after it perhaps a new beginning. Another possibility, that we may decay to that point of futility when we would be taken over by a more vigorous people. Or perhaps out of a long darkness, out of turmoil and cataclysms, some reconstitution might happen in the West. Who can know? Here philosophy and revelation have been in agreement. We must not think that we can predict the future in any detail. The Greeks knew that history was the field of accident and chance, and that therefore there could be no philosophy of history. The Jews and the Christians had been told that God's time is the best time, and that the future was in the hands of an inscrutable holiness. But one thing is clear: a civilization cannot turn away from its fate, and the fate of the West has been to be open to many things, to comedy and tragedy, as well as to anxiety and charity and shame. These days, when any silly journalist, the last of the last men, feels ready to ridicule Christianity without knowing that the very language he is using for that criticism comes forth at its deepest from that which he is criticizing, it is well to remember this. The West could not totally deny what it is without ceasing to be. Of course, a particular form of Christianity, Western Christianity, may have had its grave dug by secularization, and into that grave will go with it the civilization of which it was the core. But this says nothing at all about something which transcends our Western civilization, Christianity itself, apart from any particular form of it. In the face of the sheer burden placed upon the will by our conceiving of time as history, it is indeed the task of thought to try to think time within some enfoldment, to think our willing within some order in which it can be measured and defined. And for human beings, there is not only thinking but living. Thought may be our first and most important response, but still we demand the immediacy of living. If in reaction against the disorder of the will, we are led to seek some order in which time is enfolded, we cannot rest in seeking that order only in thought. We inevitably wish to live within it. We wish to meet it in all the occasions of our living, in our eating and drinking, our working and playing, our politics and worship, our loving and dying, in all our actions and in all our passions. In this moment of darkness, it is not clear how that will be done, or whether it will be done, or indeed if it can be done. The present barrenness of philosophy and religion in the official English-speaking world does not augur well for any embarking on that way. At the same time, the very presence of that official barrenness invites us to such an embarkation.
George Grant, Professor of Religion and of Political Science at McMaster University in Hamilton, with the fifth and last of his Massey Lectures for 1969, Time as History. The CBC will be publishing Time as History as a paperback book in the spring. If you'd like to reserve a copy, send $1.50 to CBC Publications, Box 500, Terminal A, Toronto. Or if you'd like to comment on the Massey Lectures, write to us at Ideas, also at Box 500, Terminal A.